right. Hi, everyone. Welcome again to AuthorStory. I'm Alexander Lim, your host. And for this episode, I'm interviewing Mark Zupan, author of the book Inside Job: How Government Insiders Subvert the Public Interest. And for those of you following along who are interested, you can go over now to the Amazon link in the description below the video and check out or get a copy of his book. So, Mark, welcome to AuthorStory. Thanks lots for being our guest.
Alex, thanks for the opportunity to be with you.
Cool. So, Mark, first off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your author story?
A son of immigrants who came from Yugoslavia. Grew up mainly in Rochester and Columbus, Ohio. An economist by training, Harvard undergrad, MIT PhD. Ended up being on the faculty of USC in Los Angeles. And then was an associate dean of MBA programs there, became a dean after that at the Eller College of Management at Arizona, and then the Simon Business School at the University of Rochester, and currently the proud president of Alfred University, a beautiful school with a proud progressive heritage in upstate New York.
Cool. President of the university. Okay, those are pretty pretty heavy credentials right there.
It's a great honor and a great opportunity.
Oh, definitely. So, Mark, let's talk a little bit about the book. For the benefit of those of us who are not familiar with it, can you just tell us a little bit more about it and what it's all about?
It's got some topicality because of the recent presidential election in the United States.
Right.
There's an outfit called the Pew Research Center that since the 60s has been annually surveying Americans and asking, do you trust government all the time, most of the time, none of the time, just part of the time? And what's interesting is we're at an all-time low right now of the extent to which the surveyed respondents trust government all of the time or most of the time. It's 19%, the most recent survey. It's lower than it was during the Watergate era. And it compares to the high point of 77% of the respondents saying they trust government all of the time or most of the time back in 1966. And I think it explains the book, the rise of candidates like Donald Trump as well as Bernie Sanders in the Democratic Party. At the key, at its essence, I'm an economist, and so we view politics as a marketplace, and what's being produced are wealth transfers. And demand side of this marketplace is made up of interest groups, whether they're producers, consumer activists, environmentalists, economic elites. They demand certain changes in policies that'll benefit their bottom line. On the supply side, they're individuals, whether they're monarchs and autocracies or elected officials in democracies, the bureaucrats, the army, the public employee base that supports the supply side. They produce the favorable wealth transfers. And typically when things have gone wrong, we've looked to the demand side to blame some interest group co-opting the system for their benefit, whether it's producers, labor unions, consumer activists, environmentalists. But what we've missed in this model typically is the role supply-siders can play, our elected officials, that they're human beings just like the individuals on the demand side. They're capable of immensely noble actions, but they also are capable of less noble actions. And so that we also need to look at the extent to which they can co-opt the system for their benefit. And whenever you're investigating a crime, you look for who has the means, the opportunity, and the motive. And folks on the supply side have all three. The point of the book is we also have to be mindful of the supply side when things go awry and the public interest doesn't get served.
Okay, and of course your book goes into this. I mean, I must say this is a different take on this matter. I mean, you approach it from an economist point of view rather than the sociologist point of view.
But we try to take into, or I try to take into account in the book perspectives that historians, sociologists, political scientists. There have been strains through all of the literature, and the economic model's largely grown up the last 50 years. So an era when democracy's been spreading, and so it's been natural to look on the demand side. If we look historically, 200 plus years ago, autocracy was the way government happened, and from that lens, we would naturally view it as folks on the supply side, the monarchs own the state and its resources. So Louis XIV could say, I am the state, and the
Right.
law is whatever I make it. And so that would have been the natural side to look at when things went wrong with the Bourbon rule of France or other regimes around the world.
Right. Excuse me. Uh, Sorry. Hello, Mark. Do you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. All right. Sorry. There's a little concern there. Okay. Some technical difficulty. Anyway. Okay. So okay. Got that. Cool. So definitely, it's a different matter now with democracies, democratic governments definitely being widespread throughout the world today. Well, more widespread compared to previous times.
And one of the key insights of the book, it's the first to show that our founders of this country got it right. They looked at history, when things had gone wrong with government,
Right.
and they reasoned that people aren't angels, and so we have to set in motion checks and balances.
Right.
And the book shows that if you're going to bet on a governance form, that democracy is superior to autocracy when it comes to public sector integrity. There's a group out of Germany called Transparency International,
Right.
and for roughly the past 20 years, they've annually been rating each country around the globe how clean its government is on a scale of 0 to 100, with 100 being perfectly clean, 0 being perfectly corrupt.
Right.
What my book shows is that on average, democracies outdo autocracy. All that said, though, we can't stop. Francis Fukuyama, a noted political theorist, when the Berlin Wall fell,
Right.
wrote a very optimistic book saying democracy is the socioeconomic terminus. It's the end of history, in essence. That government by the people, or democracy, doesn't necessarily ensure government for the people. What it also shows us that a quarter, at least, of the world's democracies do worse than the average autocracy when it comes to public sector integrity. So just having a democracy isn't enough.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, in the democracy, you gotta work for it. I mean, freedom ain't free.
And there's still checks and balances, still institutional reforms. We've seen over the past week and a half, Steve Ballmer, one of his latest initiatives is launching a venture called U.S. Facts.
Right.
He was struck by the extent to which there's not transparency on how our government dollars are used.
Yep.
So the whole initiative is to better track and provide that, reduce the opaqueness in the system. And so those are some of the forces like Transparency International that operate for the public good.
Right. Okay. Got that. Cool. So first off, to our listeners, I would just like to acknowledge if you hear a cat meowing in the background, that's mine. So there. Okay.
Although, Alex, I have a cat too, so but he's being quiet today. So.
All right. Okay. All right. Two cat people talking. Okay. Cool. So, Mark, with regards to the book, was there an aha moment that made you think, I should write this book, or was this more like a gradual accumulation of, realizations over time?
Gradual realization. I've done research in the 1980s with a colleague who was then a professor at Harvard, and we set out to test the economic model, and so we started looking at how senators in the United States voted, and looking at a particular piece of legislation. At the time, it was in particular strip mine voting,
Right.
and how to promote environmental good. And what struck us is there were links between demand-side pocketbook interests that could be related to how individual senators voted,
Right.
but they had very weak explanatory power. That we found it was more the ideological goals of individual senators and how we could predict how a senator would vote on strip mining legislation based on how they voted, for example, on abortion legislation. And so that led us to then start questioning, well, maybe on individual issues like strip mining, there's a lot of slack that legislators are afforded to vote their principles. But maybe at election time, every 6 years, we put into office particular ideological bundles that on net as voters or demand side interests we hope will do us good. But even when we looked at election time, we were struck at how much slack there was, even in a democracy like the United States. It's well established that legislators had a fair bit of latitude to vote their principles. And even though their principles, somebody like a Barry Goldwater had vastly different principles from a Ted Kennedy, those ideological goals mattered. And so that was the genesis. But then over time, thinking from historical perspectives, sociological perspectives, how you could look more broadly across governance forms like autocracies and democracies, and the fundamental importance of the supply side of politics.
Okay, got that. So let me just be clear on this one. On the demand side of this transaction, there's people who, like companies who want certain particular rights. Am I correct? I mean, just an example.
Just an example, and it's interesting to what extent very conservative economists like a George Stigler at the University of Chicago, who helped develop this economic model of politics, came to a similar conclusion to Karl Marx, that when things went awry, it was producers that would be co-opting the system. Karl Marx called them capitalists. That would hijack the system at the expense of the proletariat or the broader public interest.
Right, and the supply side is essentially the government itself, or insiders within the government who are seeking to sell influence for whatever reason, personal gain or whatever.
Yes, and in democracies, Alex, there's often symbiosis, and an example we'll use is sugar import quotas in the United States. And I guess the way to think of it, cancer is one of the leading causes of death in the United States right now. It results from our genetic code going awry, so how the DNA sequence gets out of whack.
Right.
And what's interesting about the DNA sequence is there are 4 nucleotide bases, and adenine always bonds with thymine, cytosine with guanine. So whenever there's something awry on one side of the double helix of our DNA, the genetic code's likely to be off on the other side as well, which increases the likelihood that we'll get over-replication or inappropriate replication of the code to the detriment of the organism or human life. And there's a similar thing using the sugar import quota example. What economists can show is the average American family loses about $50 a year because of import restrictions against sugar from places like Haiti and the Philippines. On net, the country loses anywhere from 500 million a year to $1 billion.
Whoa.
That's the extent to which consumers are worse off relative to how much domestic producers benefit from those protections. And there are beneficiaries, people that grow sugar in Louisiana and Hawaii. But on net, we shoot ourselves in the foot from $500 million to $1 billion a year.
Wow.
What keeps that loss in place? It's not only for $50, your and my family doesn't really have much of an incentive to go lobby our congressional rep to change the policy to show up in Washington, but producers have much more at stake, and they can exercise more political clout in Washington to keep that policy in place. So there's a demand side that's awry, but it's also the supply side. It's the people representing places like Louisiana and Hawaii that are responsive to those producer interests, and so there's a symbiosis from the demand and supply side, like the genetic code on both sides of the double helix that keep our sugar quotas in place to our detriment as a country.
Okay, right. So it's not a matter of. So what I'm getting from this is that it's not a matter of this one's a good guy, this one's a bad guy. There's some interaction, interlinking of relationships in play here, and affecting one side affects the other as well.
Exactly, and self-interest on both the demand and supply side can often in democracies work together to the detriment of the national good.
Okay, all right. Well, okay. Lots of examples there, I'm sure. So, Mark, let me ask you a little bit about the essence of democracy, because democracy is often seen as an alternative system of government, at the very least, to autocracy. And you mentioned that 2 centuries ago, autocracy was the norm. Given that, there could be a disjunct between the an autocracy, an autocratic government, and the democratic government, what would be the advantages, say, of democracy compared to autocracy when it comes to, you know, diminishing this disjunction?
Uh, the economists, the political scientists that have studied this, on average, you still want to bet on democracy when it comes to prosperity, when it comes to civil liberties, when it comes to cleanliness of government. There are a few notable exceptions. Botswana, the United Arab Emirates, Singapore have high public sector integrity scores.
All right.
But on average, there are only, I believe, 12 autocracies that are better than the average democracy. So you'd still want to bet on democracy. That said, and democracy, we can show, tends to promote greater economic growth, but democracy in and of itself is not enough. We can't rest on that laurel.
Right.
Still, even within democracies, and the last chapter of the book focuses on certain steps we need to be mindful of that we can improve the workings of democracies.
Okay, I got that. Okay, cool. So, your book covers not only the U.S. government, but also governments of other nations, both present and historical. Is this correct?
Correct, and we read about this or see it in the social media or on TV,
right,
practically a daily basis, whether it's autocracies like Iran,
right,
Venezuela, nowadays North Korea. Think about all the challenges there. But it's also true, I think about democracies like Brazil and some of the corruption issues at the heart of their government, or in India, the world's largest democracy by population. In a recent year, a survey there indicated that over 50% of those surveyed indicated that over the past year they'd had to pay a bribe for a public service. And over 70% of the poorest Indians over the past year reported having had to pay such a bribe.
Okay, but I mean, if so I'm thinking, like, I mean, in an autocratic government, you might have to do the same thing, like pay bribes and things like that. So, what is it about the interplay in democracy that makes it, in general, a better bet with regards to prosperity and personal rights?
It's a great question, and look, for example, as part of the book in 2014, how long the existing regime had remained in power. And autocratic regimes are in power 9 times as long as democratic regimes. And yet they produce poorer results when it comes to prosperity and when it comes to the cleanliness of government. So think about how that is inverse to what we see in the private sector marketplace, where if you produce a better product, you stay in business longer, but if you produce superior outcomes, you're more likely to go bankrupt. Power is the currency of the realm in politics, so what it allows is this perverse outcome to happen, that not only do you screw over the country more, but because you can hold on to power, you can hold on to that adverse consequence for a longer period of time. And why democracies do better is they come with certain checks and balances, term limits, electoral competition. Louis XIV or Mobutu in Zaire isn't subject to really effective electoral competition, and that keeps them locked into power. And there's less likely to be these golden parachutes. You can promise certain things in the corporate sphere and buy out the management, and they have some confidence that their outgoing contract will get honored by the courts.
Right.
You're in political power, we can promise Louis XVI or Marie Antoinette a certain outcome, but when they're out of power, they don't have the ability to enforce the promises anymore. And what happened to them is whatever was promised got changed.
Right.
And they met they met their demise due to the promise being changed. Same with right now the leader of North Korea, Kim.
Yeah.
He apparently has a real soft spot for Swiss cheese. He was a college
Okay.
in Switzerland. How much could we promise them in Emmentaler cheese to get them out of power?
Right.
But what confidence would he have that he would be assured of safety and the cheese going forward once he relinquishes power? Especially when you've got people that you've murdered,
Yeah.
or other people that have a strong interest to get even with you for what you've done.
Right. Okay. All right. So this kind of brings up the. I mean, we all know that governments have fallen. I mean, kingdoms have fallen, states have fallen. Where I'm just curious. Can you give sort of like a parallel case study where the fall of a historical empire government parallels a similar situation in any present nation existing today?
Um, Great question, and one that would point to is the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
Paul Kennedy, a noted historian, wrote a book 30 years ago called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers.
Mm-hmm.
And what he talked about is at the beginning of the book, let's say we went back 500, 600 years,
Right.
and tried to predict which nation state would be the most powerful today. And he argues that China and the Ottoman Empire were really on top of the world at that time, and he would have predicted they would be the top dogs at this present time.
Right.
So why did both, when you reread his book, it's really an inside job story, how people on the supply side brought those storied empires or ground them to a halt. And it's an interesting thing in the Ottoman Empire. It's not just the sultans and the way they did succession planning. It wasn't really well specified. It was whichever son could get to the capital the quickest with the most power. So it was very indeterminate, and there were these races to capture once your father passed away. But there were also other elements. And sometimes certain institutions we set up may work for a while, but then contain the seeds of a country's own decay. And the Janissaries, their fabled fighting force, is a great example along those lines. They wanted to promote a meritocracy in their army, and the way they did that to the Ottomans is they would basically go to the lands that they had raided and captured and find the most able-bodied Christian male youth, ship them to Istanbul and indoctrinate them. And it was one generation meritocracy. These Janissaries were very gifted athletically, physically. They were the point of the spear of the Ottoman Empire. But once they started to acquire power, they realized what they had, and it no longer became a one generation meritocracy. If I'm a Janissary, my son can be a Janissary. More educational benefits, more material benefits in general. 2 sultans were murdered trying to reform the Janissaries. And then they were a key reason, because they became so encrusted in power and resistant to change, that the Ottoman Empire became the sick person of Europe. And then also the public scribes. When the printing press emerged, the Sultan feared for the spread of knowledge, as did the scribes, as much for losing their jobs, the printing press. So for 250 years, the printing press was outlawed in the Ottoman Empire by the supply side of politics. 1800, only 2% of citizens of the Ottoman Empire could read. At the same time, the literacy rate in places like England and Denmark was 50%. So the crimp on knowledge and its diffusion and how it limited innovation also contributed to the demise of the Ottoman Empire, and very much a supply side story.
Okay, so would you know of any similar like supply side situation occurring in like the present and existing nation today?
I would argue that we have this to worry about in the United States as well as China, that of the richest people in China, for example, the world's largest autocracy, 1/7 of them are within government. So when we look at why the current president Xi has been so resistant to changing and to limiting the power of state-owned enterprises and subjecting them more to competition, it's very much because those within power are intimately involved with those state-owned enterprises. So the last thing you want to do is introduce more competition to what's the source of your wealth. And in the United States, looking at public sector unionization, it's grown from 6% in the 1970s to now close to 37%. So President Grover Cleveland used to say a public office is a public trust. Nowadays, we have to worry about public sector trusts and the extent to which they not only exercise electoral influence on who they elect and who will supposedly manage them, but just their incrustation of power in the United States. And it shows up in cases like K through 12 public education, and looking at outcomes and how insulated most large public school districts are. There's been a decrease by over 80% the last 3 decades in the sheer number of public school districts. So it's created greater monopolies on the supply side and increased per pupil spending by 3 times in real terms since the 1970s. But most people would argue the outcomes, how college-ready students are, and graduation rates have not improved, notwithstanding the spending. And then a final example from the United States, unfunded pension liabilities at the state and local government level. I have a former colleague at Rochester, Robert Novi Marks, and Josh Rao at Stanford, who works with him. They estimate that unfunded pension liabilities total close to $5 trillion in the United States.
Whoa.
They're the second largest fiscal challenge after Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, and larger than Social Security. And Detroit, Paul Krugman in the New York Times will argue, is an isolated example. They will argue that it's not. The 3 cities in California have gone bankrupt in recent years. What we see currently playing out in Illinois and Chicago and Philadelphia and Houston and Dallas and Puerto Rico's bankruptcy. So this isn't an isolated incident. There's been a tendency to kick the can down the road. The public sector still relies on defined benefits. The private sector has switched to defined contributions, where employees fund their own pension as employees. When you look at what dragged down Kodak or GM, a lot had to do with defined benefit plans, where companies would promise a lot, but when more competition got introduced, it became increasingly hard for a Kodak or a GM to fulfill those promises, to the detriment of the company and its current employees.
Okay, all right. Definitely, it's always been a concern, and definitely it hasn't changed. It's still a concern now then.
Correct. So democracies or autocracies both have to worry about their supply sides of politics.
Right, okay, cool. So, Mark, let's get on to, we've been talking about governments, large scale, macro scale. Let's talk a little bit about on the micro scale, on Joe or Jane average. Let's say they have all this information, all this knowledge, and you had only enough time to tell him or her one thing about, how they can address or manage the situation in their own personal lives. What would be that one thing that you would tell them, and why?
Great question, Alex. The closing chapter of the book uses this analogy from The Wizard of Oz and Dorothy wearing the red slippers. So she had the power all along. And what we can do is take heart from the fact that democracies are an improvement on autocracies, that democracies, although it's been in fits and starts, are still on the rise. They've been improving their integrity scores at a quicker rate than autocracies.
Mm-hmm.
So there's much to take heart in, but our work is not done yet. And so as individual citizens, even though it's hard, even though it's messy, it's like the Daniel Day-Lewis movie about the passage of the 13th Amendment and how it wasn't pretty.
Okay.
It took a lot of hard work, but that's our unfinished business, that government by the people doesn't ensure government for the people. And so we have to keep looking for what further improvements, what further checks and balances will produce better outcomes for the an entire nation, or an entire city, or an entire state.
Right. Okay. So definitely, people really do have to be involved to check, to minimize what's going on.
Yeah, that's what democracy is about, and that's what checks and balances, whether they're the media, or organizations like Transparency International that promote benchmarking, whether it's looking at term limits, moving away from defined benefit plans, rethinking the ability to unionize on the supply side. Anything that promotes monopoly power, we should be skeptical of, just like we do in private sector marketplaces.
Right. Okay. I got that. Cool. So, Mark, I wish we could talk, but time's a little out. So, very interesting subject, I must say. And so, in closing, the book is Inside Job: How Government Insiders Subvert the Public Interest. The authors are guest Mark Zupan, and you can find this book on Amazon. It's also published by the Cambridge University Press. So, Mark, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for being an Author Story. It's very insightful having you here explain things to us today.
Alex, really appreciate the opportunity, and all the best to you and your listening audience.
Cool, thanks lots. So if any of you listeners want to know more about this very important, very impactful topic, which is still very important today, please feel free to go ahead and check out Inside Job, which you can do so right now by going to the Amazon link in the description below the video. And if you'd like to follow our author interviews on YouTube, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. So bye for now, everyone. I'll be back on Author Story next time with another inspiring author.